You might be done with COVID, but is COVID done with you? This is episode 74 of En Route. Well, hello and welcome to En Route, the podcast where we talk about the journey of faith and how it intersects with religion, politics, and culture. I'm Dennis Sanders. I'm your host. Good to see you. Well, next month we will be coming to the 2-year mark since COVID became a daily part of our lives. And it's also unfortunately been 2 years since COVID became a culture war issue. Now, with little fanfare, just a few days ago, America passed the 900,000 mark, 900,000 lives lost to COVID. After 2 very long years, after all of this death and sickness, everyone is tired. We are tired of wearing masks. We are tired of having events canceled. We are tired of the culture war. We are just tired. Journalist Barri Weiss recently proclaimed that she was done with COVID. We're told you get the vaccine and you get back to normal. And we haven't gotten back to normal. And this is what Barri Weiss said on Real Time with Bill Maher. And she continues, and it's ridiculous at this point. If you believe the science, you will look at the data we did not have 2 years ago. You will find out that cloth masks do not do anything. You will realize you can show your vaccine passport at a restaurant and still be asymptomatic and carrying Omicron. Of course, we're dealing with a virus that didn't even exist 3 years ago. So we're still learning about it as we go along. But even with that, is Weiss right? Are we done with COVID? No, says Methodist Pastor Drew McIntyre. McIntyre is the pastor of Grace United Methodist Church in Greensboro, North Carolina. He also happens to be the spouse of a doctor. And he took to the internet recently to write a blog post reflecting on COVID over these last few years through the eyes of his physician wife. And looking at the pandemic through his wife's experiences really gave him a real-time view of the virus. And that view isn't pretty. He sees it not as abstract, but actually as real, as something that is actually still affecting lives. I'm glad to have him back. He was here earlier, a few episodes back, talking about Black Lives Matter. And he is back here again, and in this talk, we will talk about the problem of ignorance passing as knowledge, selfishness as freedom, and what it means to be a person of faith and to act as a person of faith in this time of a pandemic. So, let's listen to Drew McIntyre. Well, it's good to have you back here, Drew.
Good to be with you, Dennis. Thanks a lot for having me.
So one of the things I've been wanting to talk about for a while is kind of where the church is at when it deals with COVID. And we're kind of hitting the 2-year mark of the pandemic. And, we're not where we were in March of 2020. But we're in a different place. And I wanted to kind of talk about, you have an essay that will be coming out in a few days, and kind of about various parts of what we're dealing with in the pandemic. And highlighting the fact that your wife is a doctor and has had to deal with some of this up front.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think I want to talk about, and I've heard this more than once from a lot of different people, is the kind of belief that they are done with COVID. And there's a part of me that kind of wants to agree to a point that, I have been vaccinated, I've been boosted. But there's also a part of me that keeps thinking that doesn't feel right. For lack of a better phrase, it feels like we're not ready yet. Not that we are, again, back in March of 2020, but that this isn't over yet. I guess I like to say that this is the beginning of the end, but not the end. What are your thoughts about that when people say that?
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong. I think that came from Barri Weiss.
Yes, it did.
Barri Weiss, and I'm often fairly sympathetic to her viewpoints.
Yeah, same here.
But I'm finding lately that a lot of people who I'm often sympathetic with, I don't have a lot of patience for right now. We can talk about some others too, but I think it's, as an aspiration, that sounds great. I thought we were done with COVID after the first wave, and then I thought we were done with COVID after Delta. And I don't know what it's like for where you are, but where I am, in the last week, we've had the highest COVID numbers we've ever had in my area.
Mm.
So when people say done with COVID, I don't know what they're talking about. I tongue in cheek, I think I put up a tweet likening the I'm done with COVID to when Michael Scott declared bankruptcy. Right? Like, you can't just declare it and it's a thing. This isn't, I don't believe in the law of attraction. I don't think naming it, unless you're God, speaking it into existence is not a thing.
Not name it, claim it doesn't work here.
Yeah, unless you're Yahweh, just naming things doesn't make them true. I get it. I mean, I'm exhausted by COVID. As you said, my wife is a physician. She works in our local hospital system. She's in family medicine. She sees COVID patients. She sees them both in the clinical setting and has seen them in the ER and had patients very sick and dying and had whole families in the hospital. I mean, it's bad stuff. So it's been a conversation for like our family every night for 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm tired of it. I get it. I'm sympathetic, but that doesn't mean that the numbers aren't up here for us locally right now. And I don't know. I said this in the piece, but I'm generally someone that's pretty, have a lot of empathy for others. I'm usually someone that can get along with anyone and understand different worldviews and all those things. But some of this stuff I've really struggled with COVID. And that attitude would be one of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would think that this really would, if you're someone that believes in trying to love everyone, to kind of have at least a forgiving heart, that this has to be a challenge at this time. When you find people that may not be thinking about this as in the same way that you are, that are kind of thinking it's just kind of, they should be done with this.
Yeah, and I'm sure Barri Weiss is tired like everyone else is, but gosh, I'm sure nurses and people that take the trash out of, the ER rooms and teachers and anyone that's had to work with the public, in an essential kind of setting, people that work in the grocery stores, I'm sure everyone is exhausted with this. But again, that doesn't mean it's over. That doesn't mean our responsibilities to our neighbors end. That doesn't mean that another variant can't come next that's significant, if not worse. God help us if that's the case. Of course, it's great that we have vaccines and boosters and we have enough PPE now, and all those things help a whole lot. Mm-hmm. But a lot of people are still sick and dying. Thankfully in my church, mostly it's been mild cases, but a whole lot of my friends have buried a lot of folks from their churches. And that, that doesn't just go away because we want it to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, in our own house, my husband tested positive about 2.5 weeks ago. So that led towards disruption for him because he basically had to sequester himself for about 2 weeks. Luckily, it was mild. That also affected me because being in the same house, I was gone for a few days from work and kind of waiting to see how things would turn out. Again, that's why I always feel a bit uncomfortable when I hear the done with COVID thing, because it's one of the things you want to believe, but I've just had the experience that I've had kind of says, I don't think we're totally done with it yet.
Yeah. I'm sure, after a year of the Spanish flu, people want to be done with it, with the influenza epidemic. Doesn't make it so, unfortunately. And I'm glad you and your husband are okay.
Thank you. What do you think is behind kind of all in some ways, either if we even went farther back to the resistance when it comes to vaccines or refusing to wear a mask, or, is it tribalism? Is it selfishness? I mean, what's happening that even something just as simple as putting on a mask can be this, great big issue, as if, it's some type of human rights issue.
I know. It's really hard to understand. And I think, again, this is where I struggle in some cases to be charitable. And I try really hard to be, I love the adage, when things get tough, get curious. I try to be curious about people and wonder whether I try. With vaccines, I can understand folks that are who some people do have bad reactions to vaccines in general, or are just have compromised immune systems, and especially when it was very, very new. I understand some hesitancy. I feel like now sort of the science is pretty much in, and the evidence is fairly obvious that they're very effective. The mask stuff, though, has been very bizarre to watch, especially, there's some of these cases of parents showing up at school and threatening to beat up the principal over their kid wearing a mask and this kind of stuff. I do think, especially with that stuff, it has been somehow tied to identity, to political identity. There's some tribalism that's going on there for sure. There's, I have sympathy for sort of a civil libertarian kind of view, but it has been amazing to watch how, like, a 5-inch piece of cloth or paper can reduce an otherwise functional adult to a toddler. We've been working with, we have a daughter who's a little over 2, and been working with her on wearing a mask in case for when she goes back to daycare and stuff. And, she has less of a problem wearing a mask than a lot of adults, that I've encountered and heard about. It's been so strange. Like, it's this sign of, and the weirdest stuff, of course, is the arguments Christians come up with, right? Like, you can't cover the image of God, or these sorts of strange arguments that Christians make. But I don't view it that significantly different than a seatbelt, right? Which is normal now, but when seatbelt laws came out, it was a crisis.
And there was, again, issues about freedom and, I remember that.
But I feel like seatbelts is similar too, in that, it's even a better case than seatbelts, because with seatbelts, if you don't wear a seatbelt, you're mostly going to hurt yourself. All right. So I could in some ways see, like, if people want to be dumb, let them be dumb, whatever. But with masks, it's about other people. It's more like, I say this in the piece, it's more like smoking in public, right? Yes, you have the freedom to do this up until that freedom butts up against someone else. And to me, that's a very clear case to me, that if my freedom of action could negatively impact someone else, especially right now with Omicron, most people that I know that have gotten it don't know they have it until they took a test, because it's fairly mild for a lot of people, thank God. So literally, you can be spewing this stuff out to everyone around you. If you're not wearing a mask, you have no way of knowing that because you may not have symptoms. So to me, if you don't, unless you think that we should just have smoking in every public place like it's 1976, I don't understand any sort of logical case about it. I think it is mostly for a lot of folks about this sort of tribal identity that because I am X, I must be against masks and mandates and vaccines. And in some cases, that's a package deal, and other folks it's more nuanced. I mean, I want to name that, but I don't know what you think. It's just been bizarre to watch for me.
Yeah, I don't understand some of it. I think right in this period, I won't say I'm totally ambivalent, because in this recent bout with COVID, whenever I would go to visit, my mom lives not too far from me. We tried not to visit as much, but when I did, I would wear a mask because I didn't know if I had COVID. And I actually think I did, but it was the antigen test. So, but I felt kind of that same way. And so in those cases, that seems to make sense. I struggle at times of, okay, if I go into a store, do I need to put on a mask, even if I'm vaccinated and all of this? But if it's requiring it, I don't see a problem with that. Or if it's in a very close quarters, I'm probably going to put on a mask until, we're safe. Because, I think, again, we're at least personally, that we're in this really confusing time when it's not what we were, but we really aren't where we were, at least for that brief shining moment in the summer where we could just take off our masks and we're done. And even though I'm vaccinated, I can also still get it. And I can also still pass it along to someone. So, I'm not crazy about it, but, like today I just placed an order for another batch of N95 masks. So, it's one of those things that at some point I don't like it, but it's kind of like, what are you going to do? And, and I think ultimately it is caring about the other person. You don't want to personally, just from what I've understood about COVID, hurt someone inadvertently. And, it's not the end of the world.
Yeah. And, for us, it's been primarily about our daughter, right? Because we got vaccinated when we could, we got boosted when we could, but our daughter's too young for any available vaccine so far. And yes, in general, kids do okay with it, but my wife's a physician and she knows if you've ever been to a doctor, they give you the worst possible scenario, right? And not only does she know the worst possible scenario just intellectually, in some cases she's seen it, right? Like she's treated the worst case scenario. So it's been a very real thing for us. And also we have older parents, we don't want them to catch something from us. I mean, in terms of church stuff, I think about, again, church members who are older, church members who are immunocompromised because they're doing cancer treatments, church members who have small children at home. And again, with Omicron, it's not been as bad, especially with like kids and stuff in some ways. But those are the folks I think about. If it's just me and take risks and then whatever, I'm boosted and all the things. But when it's those who are most vulnerable to this thing, at least for Christians, that should at least give us pause when we're considering these questions.
Yeah, and I think places like church or that are indoors, close in, it makes sense. I mean, God is not going to be upset that you wore a piece of cloth over your face. I mean, I'm sorry. God is fine with you. So if you think God is upset, that's your problem, actually. And my church, we went for a while without masks, but actually it was back in the late summer, someone who came down with COVID was there, but luckily I think most people were masked already. So we just decided we're going back to wearing masks while we're indoors. And so, I will take it off, of course, to preach, but other than that, the mask is on for the same reason. We have older people that are there. But my mother comes with me to church. She's 88. I would like to make sure she can see 89. So, again, it's kind of something that you have to do. It's kind of the same thing. I don't understand people who get upset like flying. Back in the fall, my husband and I flew to DC for our cousin's funeral, cousin's wedding. And, we had to wear our masks the entire time. It's a little weird, but it was also okay. There have been literal fights of people not wanting to wear a mask. And
yeah. Which means that someone, bought a ticket, got on the plane the whole time knowing that was going to be asked of them, and made a decision at 30,000 feet that they weren't going to, and that's like a level of, I don't know, malevolence or something.
And also a really expensive choice, because, you're plunking down a few $100s to get on a plane, and then you're going to decide this is the perfect time I'm going to act like a jerk. No.
Yeah, not just to ruin your experience, but also the experience of literally everyone on the plane with you. That's an incredibly, I don't like to be judgmental of people I don't know, but I can't see that as anything but selfish. If you really can't live with this piece of paper on your face for a few hours, when, again, my perspective is the person that I love and that's been putting herself in danger to take care of strangers for 2 years does this at least some weeks, all day, every day, sometimes multiple masks, sometimes full body PPE, like the whole 9 yards. If, you can't wear a mask on your business trip to San Antonio, I'm sorry, your life is hard. Christians in China in the underground church would like to talk to you about a hard life, And again, with Christians, I just want to say, like, if this is what you think difficulty is, I'm sorry.
Well, this is
study history.
Gets to another point is, where do you think there's kind of this, it seems like there's a missing piece of logic for Christians, because our whole religion is basically centered on the other and how do we care for the other. And we do that because, of course, that was what Jesus did. Jesus was not thinking about himself. And so what is the disconnect that we can understand this, we read it, but then when it comes to this real life situation, we don't do it?
Yeah. It makes me think of, famously Mark Knoll wrote a book 20-something years ago called The Scandal of Evangelical Mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The thesis of the book, for those who haven't read it, spoiler alert, is what he says essentially is the scandal of the evangelical mind is that there isn't much of an evangelical mind in terms of the intellectual sort of development and pursuit in the evangelical world. Now, he's saying that as an evangelical, I'm not picking on evangelicals. Lots of my friends are evangelicals. But something like that, I think we've seen in large parts of Christianity, where you're asking for, the way you asked the question was a hole in the logic, but that presumes that there's a logic going on. Whereas, again, I think it's more, what's the language? A reptile brain like response. It's not a conscious thought. And the work of Jonathan Haidt, he talks about this, that a lot of what we believe morally is sort of innate, and then we find reasons for it. I don't think in a lot of these cases folks have gotten that far into their thinking about it. Now, let's also be fair that there are folks on, let's say, the cultural and ecclesiastical left who are just as unthinkingly, doing what they're doing because they want to not be these people, right?
Yep.
So there's tribalism on both sides. I think we're both comfortable saying that. But I do think in terms of how the church has responded to COVID regarding masks and vaccines and et cetera, what you have is a whole lot of people, including clergy, who have been more discipled by their cable news channels of choice, their media pundits of choice, their news sources of choice, than they have been discipled by scripture or the tradition or the church or faith.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that's conscious, but I think that's true. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense to me. Because again, I just don't think there's a lot of thinking through it. I think there's a lot of, this is what my friends think. This is what the people around me think. This is what, it's weird because I'm in North Carolina and the community that I'm in is sort of a larger city, college town. And here masks aren't a big deal. But if you go 30 minutes any direction, it's a whole different story.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, churches, businesses, the whole 9 yards. So I suspect it has a lot to do with the fact that, as we both have, I think, talked about and addressed, in almost every church, discipleship is poor, I think. But that doesn't mean our people are not being discipled. And our people are being discipled, I think, largely by the media and sources that they interact with on a daily basis through news and podcasts and whatever else.
Mm-hmm. You had an interesting quote from Neil Postman from the book Amusing Ourselves to Death, which I have not read, but it seems to have been brought up so much during the pandemic. Now I feel like I need to read it. But it was an interesting thing that he says towards the end, the quote that you use, where people can think that ignorance is knowledge. Could you kind of explain that or kind of suss that out, what he was getting at? And what does that have to do with the church?
Yeah, I would encourage everyone to read Amusing Ourselves to Death. I mean, it's amazing how prescient that book is, considering it was written almost 40 years ago. Almost 45 years ago now, 1985. It draws a lot on Brave New World. Mm-hmm. This whole idea, the totalitarianism that a lot of folks fear is the totalitarianism of 1984.
1984, yes.
Right, that it's top down, the government does this, the authority kind of takes control. Whereas Brave New World, it's we do this to ourselves, right? We're comfortable if we can just sort of like the rat and all those experiments, they can just kind of keep hitting the pleasure button and just sort of numb ourselves to life. That you don't have to be an authoritarian like to take over. People will just sort of give up. And what Postman argues, go ahead, sorry.
I would just say that's also the word of Logan's Run, just to bring that one up. Yeah.
And I guess also in some ways, is it, what's the Pixar movie with the little robot?
Oh, WALL-E, yes.
Yeah, it's kind of WALL-E also. That's much more of a Brave New World kind of apocalypse, right? And what Postman argues is that, and he's saying this with the advent of just television, not even cable television, just television, but that the confusion of news and entertainment means that we're losing our ability to discern between real knowledge and disinformation. He likens it to like the KGB kind of stuff. Now he's saying this when there's like 4 channels. And it's just everything he said is so much more true now. And so he concludes that, by saying, he's saying, I'm saying something far more serious than that we are being deprived of authentic information. I'm saying that we're losing our sense of what it means to be well informed. Ignorance is always correctable, but what shall we do if we take ignorance to be knowledge? I mean, we see this in the church in various ways, one of which is just the attitude of this kind of American individualist, populist notion of, if I have a Bible, I don't need a seminary or a church or a Sunday school class or a preacher. I know what God said. I have my Bible. If you've ever read the Democratization of American Christianity, it talks about this somewhat. But it certainly has been true, this whole idea in the pandemic that, what's it called? Is it the Dunning-Kruger effect?
Yep, Dunning-Kruger school. Yes.
Sort of the more ignorant you are, the less likely you are to know your ignorance.
Mm-hmm.
Is this whole notion of people doing their own research. When I say this in the piece, like, okay, I went to a good seminary. I went to a seminary that on some list when I went was the top seminary in the country. It was hard school to get into. I worked very hard. I was surrounded by very bright people. And I thought that my schooling was hard. But I watched my wife go through medical school. I watched my wife go through residency. And as difficult as it was in some way, at least what I did in my training and education as a pastor was like nothing compared to what my wife did in medical school. I used to try to help her study. And I would get exhausted just reading the words from the flashcards. Like it was that hardcore. And so to watch people, to my view, denigrate not just my wife, but like her profession, the years she and her colleagues put into getting that expertise. It's very similar to how I imagine it feels when, you or I try to have a Bible study and, we've been to seminary, we've studied this, we care about it, we've done our preparation for Bible study. And I've done this, maybe you have, I give this like hour-long explanation on some chapter from the book of Revelation. And still I have someone in the back row that says, well, so-and-so on TV said this. Okay. And I don't have another hour to tell you, why so-and-so got this and believes that, where it came from, and the, Darbyism, the 18th century, 19th century, whatever. Again, not even knowing the difference between ignorance and knowledge, just assuming that anyone, because they're literate, can understand medical literature. I'm sorry. I've tried to read my wife's work. She's published in journals and stuff like that. It's its own language, in the same way that when we go to theology school or seminary, it's its own thing, and it takes time. You can't just pick that up. And even folks who are like, I don't want to get, there are people, saying someone is in medicine versus someone who's a physician or an epidemiologist. Those are different things. Because there's lots of people, in the same way that there's lots of people that work in the church, that doesn't mean they're theologians. There's lots of people that are sort of vaguely in the medical world. And I've heard this a lot in the pandemic. My so-and-so, works at a doctor's office and they said this. Well, doesn't mean that they know what they're talking about. Like, yeah, it's been stunning. And I get it in some ways, right? It's populism in some ways. It's Nichols, I think, wrote The Death of Expertise. This idea that there's no such thing as expertise. But I'm sorry, if you break your leg in a horrible car accident, you're going to show up to the ER, and you're just going to want them to do what they do. And just because you can Google for 48 hours before you make a decision about getting your vaccine or whatever, doesn't mean that you know any more than what that it's just silly. And I'm losing my words right now because it's been that frustrating. And I wrote this piece in part because 2 years into this thing, I need to process some of this stuff. And as you can see, it's a work in progress.
Do you think that people have just kind of even lost some sense of common sense? I'm not an epidemiologist, but I do know some basics of how viruses work, or that it seems like people aren't even thinking about that. And not to say that I'm on the same level as an epidemiologist, but even just the very basic rudimentary things that you would think you could understand about a virus, it seems like that escapes some people.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I mean, and obviously there's been all sorts of, I think, messaging errors and things like that. I also think lots of opportunistic folks with their own platforms and agendas have overhyped those.
Mm.
Because, it's not that science does change, it's that, right, data changes, and if you're following the science and things change, like a new variant or a new situation or whatever, then you change. There was a good thing put out by Johns Hopkins about just because the recommendations changed doesn't mean the science was wrong a year ago, or the recommendation was wrong a year ago. It means there's a new situation, and science appropriately is responding to the new situation. So, yeah, I do think there's definitely a lack of common sense. It's also, most people are acting out of self-interest to one way or another. And we should take seriously that, obviously, millions of people have been hugely negatively impacted economically, socially, spiritually, emotionally by the pandemic and the lockdowns and all that. And so maybe one charitable read is some of it comes from people genuinely feeling grief and loss and being afraid for their businesses and their livelihoods and all that. And that's probably where I could be a little bit more charitable as I'm talking about it. Again, John Haidt talks about motivated reasoning, and we're all likely to view the world in ways that are convenient to us. And I'm certainly not disinterested in my analysis and my opinion, given that, I've watched someone I love go into work with COVID every day for 2 years. And my big fear has been the hospitals getting overwhelmed such that she's no longer safe, right? Or so that she's put in a position to have to decide, does patient A, B, C, or D get a vaccine or get treatment or get a ventilator? And we're not in that place anymore, thankfully. Although staffing shortages are very serious in hospitals right now. But, so it's personal to me too. And I should acknowledge that, I'm not a disinterested observer in this. I think it's been really sad that it's been as politicized as it has. I think that has had a lot to do with it. And I've seen a lot of speculation, if it had been a different president at the time, or if the president had done this instead of that, would it be different? I don't know. That seems a little bit easy of an analysis. I read 2 books I read that were helpful that I'd recommend to your viewers and listeners. There's one called Pale Rider that was a history. Are you familiar? It's a history of the Spanish flu.
Yeah, and it's one that it's on my. I have to read it next.
It was very good. It was very good, and you'll be stunned at the parallels between 100 years ago and today. I mean, anti-mask marches and campaigns and all the things, very, very similar. So, and not just in America, but in other places too. So there is something that is not just about right now. That's to this. I also read The Plague Year. I forget the author's name. It's the same guy that wrote the book about Scientology that became the Lawrence something. It's going to bother me now. He wrote The Looming Tower. Lawrence Wright. Yeah.
Yes.
And it was basically his, as a writer, reflecting on COVID, but also talks about previous pandemics. That was very good. This sort of populist, bubbling up against public health measures, lockdowns, things like that, is something that we've seen previously. There was an example from Pale Rider. I think it was a South American country where there was a Catholic priest or bishop in a certain area who very publicly told the faithful something like that the Eucharist will protect you from the flu, and if come to church, and of course a whole bunch of his parishioners got sick and died. So culturally, but also religiously, this resistance is not new. And I was a historian kind of first in my academic love. So in some ways, it's helpful to know that this isn't all just our world sort of going to pot.
Mm-hmm.
But it's difficult not to think that the technology that we have and the ability that we have to only interact with and encounter information that we already agree with, that has to only make it worse, I would suspect.
Mm-hmm.
So in some ways it's not new. In some ways I think it's worse.
Mm-hmm.
In some ways the same impulse, it's gasoline on the fire, maybe is the best way of putting it, right? Mm-hmm. The same thing is there, but it's made much worse by our technology and cultural conditions and stuff.
Well, earlier you were talking about the fact that basically the crisis in the American church when it comes to discipleship. If we had maybe stronger discipleship programs in our congregations, how do you think it would change how people look at the pandemic?
It's a good question. A couple things. One is, if it's a discipleship that is inviting people to think of the community, like the church community, more so than just their individual selves. So if it's a discipleship that's saying it's not just me and Jesus, but I'm a part of this family, mm-hmm. then I think that changes how you approach it. It's not about, I mean, I have colleagues that they got like phone calls on the same day from families at church, and in the morning they got a phone call from a family saying, if we're not wearing masks this Sunday, we're not coming to church. And in the afternoon, they get a phone call from another family at the church saying, if you make us wear masks this Sunday, we're leaving the church for good, right? A discipleship that says you're not just you and you're not just your family, but you're part of this family. You're part of this body. That you're a part of a we that is called the church. I think if that's something you're formed in deeply, it's going to be hard to make those sorts of ultimatums, right? Or see things in that way. But it's about me and my comfort, or my family and our comfort, but what's best for the whole. Mm-hmm. That's, I think, a mature Christian perspective. And with that, too, a discipleship that invites us to see our identity, first of all, as Christians and followers of Jesus, and not first of all as either citizens of the U.S. or people on this or that side of the political spectrum, right? I'm not, so such that we're thinking about things not as, well, I'm an American and we believe in freedom, so I think this is what we should do. Or I'm an American and I'm a good liberal and I think we should do what the CDC says, right? Agree with whichever one you want to. Those are not Christian claims, mm-hmm. right? But a discipleship that says, first of all, I follow Jesus. What does that mean? And to your earlier point, love God and love neighbor. Well, that means that my neighbors, both within the church and outside of the church, are a primary part of my consideration, not just my Google search, not just whether or not I like masks, not just whether or not, I think my kids like masks or not in school. I think that whole question of identity, if discipleship is affecting our identity in a way that invites us into something higher and deeper than just our partisan affiliations, then I think it could nuance that conversation. And I've tried to make this not about sort of what I think is smart or best, but as a hopefully responsible leader and a Christian, what do I think is best for the whole? Mm-hmm. I don't like wearing masks. I still preach with a mask on. I don't like it. Mm-hmm. I'm promise I'm tired of it too. But I'm trying to do, both set an example and mm-hmm. also try to do what's best for the whole. It's not just about me. And that's like Christianity 101, because it's not just about me. And a whole lot of what I've heard and seen has been, this is what I think, this is what my family wants, this is what my, a lot of me. Not that I'm without, not that I'm perfect or don't have my own, again, selfish reasons for some of this stuff. But yeah, I don't know. How does it strike you? What do you think? Do you think discipleship could make a difference in this stuff?
I think it could. I think for some of the reasons you just said, it's. I think for those who don't want, are against putting on masks or don't want to get a vaccine, that to help them understand that the faith is not just about me, myself, and I. It is something beyond ourselves. And I think discipleship then ultimately points to Jesus, dying on the cross and all that. Again, it was this kind of act for others that, in a way of following Jesus, means that that's kind of the way that we should be living, in a way that's sacrificial. So yeah, I do think that would help. And even for those who do follow all the procedures, it's understanding it that, I'm not doing this because I'm a liberal, but it is because I'm a Christian. This is how I want to do things. So yeah, I think it gives people a foundation of what we should be doing. And I think that is something that has been missing throughout the pandemic. And this is, I know people don't these days like to talk about both sides, but it does seem like it's on both sides, that we don't really have that religious grounding of either why we're doing this or why we should do this. We're actually listening to kind of politics and, as you said, people on certain cable news channels, instead of listening to what God says.
Yeah, it seems like if you commit your life to following someone who said, take up a cross, that taking up a mask is not that big of an ask.
Yeah, it hurts less.
And look, some of my heroes, like Mando here, they wear masks all the time, and they're fine.
Yep. You had to get in the superheroes in there.
I had to, I figure it's in the background, so people are going to notice it anyway. But But yeah, I did this, when we streamed from my home office for a lot of the pandemic. I would mix up what I had in my little background here, and the kids at church got a kick out of it. Sometimes it was Baby Yoda. Sometimes I have Superman's dog, Crypto, is right there.
Oh, okay.
Mix up the collection. And of course, Green Lantern is back there. So, it just keeps people on their toes, and everyone loves a good pop culture.
Oh, I love it.
Reference.
So, I mean, you're talking kind of pop culture here, and this also is leading to, of course, the sports world. And we've had this long thing with Aaron Rodgers. I think John Stockton, which you was shared in your essay. I guess there's one of those things of trying to be, and I know Charles Barkley never said I'm not a role model, but they are role models. And is that kind of an example of really not understanding what it means to really live beyond yourself in a godly way? That it's kind of what I feel comfortable with, not necessarily what benefits the whole.
Yeah, it's also, I don't know. I don't follow sports at all. When I saw that John Stockton thing, there's certainly, I don't like impugning people's motives, but it's certainly the case that if you're a public figure who comes out questioning whatever, vaccines, masks, mandates, et cetera, you're going to get a lot of derision from sort of popular, culture and stuff. but you're also going to immediately have a tribe, right? You're gonna have some people that are going to just, give you lots of attention and adulation. Yeah, you're speaking up and all that. And I can only guess for someone like, I think it was Stockton's case. It was his season tickets to his own school were revoked because he refused to wear a mask at a basketball game. It's like that. Not quite as bad as the airplane example, but like, really, you can't watch a basketball game with a mask on? Is it that big of a? If someone can do an 8-hour surgery with a mask on, I feel like you can probably watch a basketball game sitting down with a mask on. I went to watch a movie with a mask on. I didn't like it, but I didn't die. It's fine. It is odd though how we will listen to anyone that agrees with us over an actual expert, right? Like I'm pretty sure Rand Paul was not an expert on viruses.
Yes. I don't think he's an expert on a lot of things. Virus especially.
And I don't know. My whole ministry is predicated on I'm not an expert, but I'm going to read the experts and do the best I can with what they tell me, and study with them and learn from those who are, smarter than me, and then do the best. And so it is an odd, there is this deep distrust of institutions now. And of course, being both me and mine pastors, we both know that on the church part of it. But of course, it's much deeper than that. It's government itself, government institutions, and all that. And that's dangerous. It's dangerous stuff, because what concerns me is, if there is down the road something, I read books like Andromeda Strain and The Hot Zone and all those books about fictional pandemics growing up. And if there is something that comes along that's much more deadly than what this has been, it's been deadly enough, but could be much worse. If something does come along that's significantly worse, are we going to have the cultural tools to even deal with it? Because this is pretty concerning.
No, it will be even worse. I mean, every man for himself.
Yeah. It's very strange. It's very strange. And I know lots of people in medicine, and they've seen it happen, right? They've seen it where they watch someone die from COVID and their loved ones still will not get a vaccine or wear a mask or whatever. I don't know. It's strange stuff. Hopefully, coming at this from a perspective as a follower of Jesus, what I think the church could and should be doing is modeling how we love one another in the midst of this, how we handle disagreement and differences over this, and love for our neighbors despite all that. But that also includes, we don't just function as the church, we're a part of the community. And that means, I think, also setting an example in the community,
How is the church, or how can the church be there for medical professionals? We talked a lot about, medical professionals early on. But, this has now been 2 years in, and, you have a lot of doctors, you have a lot of nurses that have been putting in lots of hours with hospitals that are filled to the brim. How can the church be there for these people?
In some ways, it's analogous, I think, to positive ways I've seen churches appreciate and support educators or veterans in some cases, right? Acknowledging that service, acknowledging the unique stressors of that role and things like that. I did find out there's a church a local church that I deeply dislike provided lunch to my wife's office recently. And I was both angry and jealous, I'm really upset. Like, it's great that they did this. I'm so upset it's this church and not my church, because if you listen to the Marcel podcast, it's a church that's very much on that model of charismatic leader and no accountability, but I won't name it because it's nationally known. But, it was, hey, here's a free lunch because you had a rough time. I know early on, Brittany's whole thing was like, don't tell me I'm a hero, just wear a freaking mask. Like, please just act, don't act dumb. Don't act, like this isn't a thing. I think there's a place just for naming that experience. If you have, people that are in medicine, that are, nurses, that are physical therapists, whatever it is, people that are having to walk into this every day, I think give someone a chance to tell their story, give someone a chance to have a testimony, lift them up in prayer. We hear you, we care about you, you matter. Acknowledge what they're doing as a ministry. I don't think we do enough of that, of naming that, the way I often talk about it is any job where you're serving other people, which can be just about any job really, is ministry, right? If you're doing it for God, doing it in a way that edifies people and improves their lives, it's a ministry. And naming that these folks that are in the medical field are doing a ministry in a very hard time and doing a very difficult ministry, I think validates that as well. My wife's calling is every bit as valid and as from God as mine is, right? It's not just ministers that are in ministry. My wife is in ministry. Nurses are in ministry. All those folks are in ministry. So treat them as such in the same way that we do with educators and others. That there's a calling there that the church should unhesitatingly validate and be grateful for and thank God for.
Last question is, how do you think churches going into year 2 can kind of be positive witnesses in their community? It was in some ways, it's just been a very weird time to be a church. 2 years ago, all of a sudden we couldn't be in person. We had to do everything online, which I don't know about you, but it was really hard to try to do things like mission. It was almost virtually impossible. Now, most churches are in person again, though, of course, with precautions. How do we try to be an effective witness to people in this time as we're still dealing with this pandemic, and maybe even to be a witness to people who right now haven't been listening?
Yeah. I know one thing I've tried really hard to do is validate for my folks the complexity of this time and the choices they've had to make. I've had a few interactions where I ran into someone I haven't seen in a while from church. I ran into him at the grocery store and like, we missed the church. We want to come back. Our kids can't be vaccinated. And, I try to validate that and say, look, these are hard choices and very personal choices. And, you're still loved. You're still welcome. Like, don't feel bad about that. Or when we went back to having some in-person stuff and people haven't been around in a while, saying like, look, I know it maybe feels weird to just pop up at a potluck or an outdoor picnic in the summer or whatever, but please know that you're still welcome and all that. I think embodying that sort of like that grace, and being able to say to people, we know that this has been a difficult time for you. I'm sure my church, me as a leader, there's things we didn't get right in this time that we could have done better. Being upfront about that, gosh, I know that's true for me. Having the grace to say, like, we've not been the perfect church during this. We've done the best we could. Here's how we're trying to move forward. And I think trying as much as possible to say we respect that everyone is not going to agree with whatever the step is. What we're doing now, what we're about to do, you're still loved and your perspective is still valid and you're still welcome here. And we regret that we can't make everyone, do what everyone thinks we should. We're doing the best we can to follow Jesus and to make this the best church we can for everyone. I think avoiding simplistic moralizing on both sides is a good thing. Acknowledging those complexities, I think, is helpful. Treating people like adults. And I think it's going to be, doing what we can when we can. Like right now, things are really bad where I am. There's not a lot we can do. There's still things that we can do and we can celebrate. We had a big offering at Christmas that supports the work of Zoe. Zoe does really amazing work empowering orphans and vulnerable children around the world. And so even in this pandemic, when there's not a lot we can do with our own two hands, we've supported this community of over 130 children who are being given skills and education to raise themselves out of poverty in a small village in Kenya that I've never heard of before this. So that's something that we have been able to do, even if it's not something we've done with our own two hands, and to celebrate that and say, look, God's work is still being done. Ministry is still happening. You're still a part of it. Even if the world is not back to normal yet, there's still a part that you can play in God's redemptive story.
Okay. Well, Drew, thank you. And I want to also just lift up a prayer of thanks and continued prayers for your wife as she continues to do the good work and tiring work, and pray that this will end soon. So
thank you. Yeah. And for all those, we got a ton of people in my church that are physical therapists and nurses. And I think, all those folks need those prayers. Anyone that's going into those rooms with their PPE on and they deserve our prayers for sure. So thank you for this time to talk. And again, like as it's very clear from this, I'm still processing all this stuff. It's been nice just to have a conversation about it from a theological perspective.
All right. Well, we will definitely talk again soon. So,
all right. Thanks, Dennis.
All right.
Bye.
Bye. Well, I want to thank Drew for coming back on the podcast to talk about this very timely issue. I always have a good time chatting with him, and I'm looking forward to having him back and chatting with him again. I also, before I forget, is to remind you to check out his own Drew's podcast. He has a podcast that he does with his friends, pastor friends Evan and Will, called God and Whiskey Podcast. And basically, the podcast describes itself. It is a time of kind of talking about theology, and they also talk about their favorite whiskeys. So I have put the link in the description. I hope that you will consider listening. It is a great listen, even if you don't drink whiskey. So I wanted to share this concluding thought. Last September, my husband Daniel and I we traveled to Washington, D.C. We were going down to the wedding of of a cousin of mine. And I lived in D.C. actually in the early 90s. So this was the first time back. It was good to be back. We walked around the National Mall, and it was just fascinating to see how much things had changed since I left in 1996. One of the things that we saw was temporary. It was a temporary installation on the mall, but I think it will probably leave a mark. As we were walking and getting closer and closer to the Washington Monument, we could start to see this basically sea of little white flags that basically almost, if not totally, encircled the monument. And what we learned was that these flags represented, which was at that point, 700,000 Americans who had died because of COVID. Now, that number can be viewed in the abstract and not given much thought. 700,000 is just a number. But with all those flags fluttering in the late summer breeze, you really couldn't ignore the sheer magnitude of the pandemic. All of us want to say that we're done with COVID. After all, most of us might be vaccinated, or maybe we're not. But after 2 years, isn't it time to move on? And to be honest, there are some people that sometimes it feels like they're stuck in wanting to live the way we did in March and April of 2020. And of course, we can't live that way forever. That's not a good way to live. But the thing is that we also can't go back to February of 2020 because COVID really isn't done with us yet. The hospitals are still full, and the medical staff that fill those that staff those hospitals remain incredibly busy. And while the most recent variant, Omicron, is mild for those who are vaccinated, it still caused millions to become sick. And I'm hoping that we don't have any more variants. But the fact is, we don't know what's coming down the pike. Now, the advent of the vaccines has made life a whole lot better than what it was in 2020. And I tend to think that we are at the beginning of the end of the pandemic. But that's the beginning of the end. That is not the end. No matter how much we might want to be done with COVID, it won't be done until COVID is totally weakened and endemic. And we're not at that point yet. The best that we can do right now is to try to be cautious within reason and to practice patience, to practice a lot of patience. We aren't done with COVID, and COVID is still not done with us. So just a few housekeeping notes. Don't forget to make sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. The links are in the show notes. You can check out the website at enroutepodcast.org, where we are trying to place some additional material about each podcast episode. Trying to squeeze time in my busy week to get that done, but hopefully just check it out and see what you'll find. If you ever have a question or comment, and I do love to have those questions and comments, drop me an email. And you can send it to reverendpodcast@gmail.com. And like I said, I really do want to hear your questions and comments, so send those emails. Also, consider leaving a rating or a review on on your favorite podcast app. Podcasts, like everything online these days, run on algorithms. And the more positive reviews makes it a whole lot easier for others to find this podcast. And we really do need a podcast like this that can look at mainline Protestantism from a view that very few people look at, that's appreciative of the tradition, but also looks at it with a critical and curious eye. And I need your help to help spread the message of this podcast. And I've made it easy for folks. You can click a link in the show notes that leads directly to the podcast app of your choice that allows for ratings and reviews. So go to the link, ratethispodcast.com/church and Maine to leave your rating or review. And I want to give a quick shout out of thanks to the anonymous soul who made a one-time donation. Thank you so much. That really means a lot. If you would like to make a donation, you can use the link in the subscription. Those donations help cover some of the costs associated with this podcast. It helps me to continue to produce good content, and it is greatly, greatly appreciated, whatever amount you give. So that is it for this episode of En Route, a journey on faith and modern life. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. Take care, Godspeed, and we will see you soon.